Hey guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another PaintShop Pro video. Today I'm going to be demonstrating some techniques for doing sky replacement. So before we get started, I do want to mention that there is another video that I have that focuses on using luminance masks, and luminance masks are kind of a nice and simple way to be able to take a blown out sky, bring some of its fidelity back in or its detail back in. This usually works out if the sky is of a much different luminance from the foreground and you're wanting to use the original sky, not trying to put like a totally different sky, which is what we're focusing on here today. So check out that video if that's something you're more interested in. Here I'm just going to show two different approaches, one a little bit more basic and another more complex, of replacing skies, completely new skies, not related to the original image. And one thing I do want to just point out that I think the act of replacing a sky, removing an existing sky, replacing it, is not too complicated. A lot of the effort really goes into just maintaining, balance or cohesion with the two different images after you've brought the new sky in. So really the two examples are just going to show methods of being able to maintain that balance after introducing a new sky. So for this first example, as you can see, very standard scene, got this image from pexels.com, and the image is fine and it looks great. What we want to do is replace this sky that you see here with something much more like vibrant, a little bit more sunrisey, but more purplish in color. So first thing we're going to do with this image here is we'll duplicate, and then I'm going to use the background eraser to kind of do the erasure of this sky. I think it works pretty well because there's a nice defined line here, but you can use selections or masking or any other method that you prefer. Since I am using the background eraser, one technique that I like to do is to add a new raster layer and drop it behind, and then use the flood fill tool with something very obvious like black and just fill that. So then now when I have my copied background layer selected and I'm using the background eraser, it becomes really obvious how well that erasure is actually happening. Like you can see how in some areas where it doesn't quite get, it leaves a little bit of gray or some transparency. Just by brushing over it a little bit further, you can resolve a lot of that. If you do go over, you can always just undo and then continue again. If it seems like you're bleeding over a little bit too much, you can always increase the sharpness of the background eraser brush and then continue on. And really, we only need to create just enough buffer room around the edge where we care about isolating, and then thereafter we can just use the freehand selection tool and just kind of draw along that buffer region and then capture the rest of the sky and then just hit delete. And now we've got our separation. Now, one thing you'll may notice, is having issues with halos. We'll cover that in a little bit more specific detail in the next example, but for this one, because of the sky we're choosing, it doesn't really cause too much of a problem. So then we can go to this new sky, right click on the image and say copy. Then go back to our image where we want to replace the sky and paste as a new layer. If you did like I did and it pasted on top, you can always just click and drag underneath so that it shows up behind. So now we can zoom out a little bit, use the pick tool, and then with this we can kind of arrange it so that the background mountainy scene kind of disappears. There we go. And so now we have our new sky in place of our original mountain image. But kind of like what I was saying, even though we have successfully placed the new sky into the scene, it doesn't really match. It doesn't seem like there's really a lot of cohesion here. Like, the lighting might be a little bit, matching with the source of light being somewhere on the right side of the image. But because of the very blue greenness of the foreground and the purple of the sky, it doesn't really work out. So one quick thing we can do to try to get these to match, as I feel like the main difference here is the color, is to select our copy of the background and then go to adjust white balance. Or actually, what I'd rather do is use an adjustment layer. So what we can do in this case is, since we want the adjustment to be isolated to just the foreground, what we want to do first is to, with that foreground selected, create a new layer group, and then with that background layer selected, go to adjustment layers, white balance. And what this does, doing the adjustment layer, is just nice because it's a non-destructive way of applying the change, so you can always go back at any time and readjust it even after you've applied it in this first pass. So these controls are a little bit different than what's actually in the white balance in the other dialog that you saw, so you kind of have to approach it a little bit differently, but you can still have a very similar effect on your image. And so, as we can see, very greenish, very bluish, and then we want it to be more purple. So then really what we want to do is take this middle slider and start dragging it to the left. And you can see that as we do that, it really starts to kind of bring this foreground into with what the new sky is, so that they start to match each other. And you can go really far, and if it feels like it's too much, then you can kind of dial it back. It's the whole Goldilocks effect and just trying to find what is just right. So now if we take all the new things we added and select them and then put them in their own layer group, then now we can kind of see the difference much more easily. I can turn this group off. There's the original. Turn this on, and we can see that now we have this nice cohesive image where we've replaced the sky and the foreground matches. All right, so for this next sky replacement demonstration, this one's going to be a little bit more complex. We're going to take this very kind of drab looking sky and replace it with this much more vibrant blue sky that seems like something from a Windows desktop background. But essentially what we'll notice though is there's a pretty significant disparity in both saturation and even contrast of that image with this one. So there's a few things we're going to have to do. We're not just going to have to mess with the foreground, but also even what I'm going to call this middle ground, which is this rock region here. So let's kind of go down that path, see some of the things that we need to do to get these two to be cohesive once we join them together. So once again, first thing we're going to do is duplicate, so we have the original, and then we can work with this background. Again, I'm going to use the background eraser, so still use my same technique of creating sort of a background to make visualizing what my erasure, how effective my erasure is actually going, and then just start erasing the background. And so for this first pass, I'm going to actually keep the middle ground, this rock area. And then we'll isolate that a little bit better later. Now, one other thing too you'll notice is that we're getting that haloing again, and in this demo we'll kind of address that a little bit more. Even while using the background eraser, decreasing sharpness can help with that, as you can see that oftentimes can help, but you do have to be a little bit careful, because if you, with this lower sharpness, if you get too far into regions like these, you'll start erasing more than you really want to. But you can see it does a pretty good job already just by making that single adjustment. So now once again, just to isolate the sky fully without having to use an eraser tool all the way, you can just use the lasso, select the last bit of regions and delete. Okay, so next we can drag in our new sky, paste it as a new layer, drag it behind if it shows up on top, and then use the pick tool to kind of, arrange where you want it to be. May need to do some size adjustment if you want, depending on how many clouds or any other artifacts that you might have in your fake sky. So again, if we look at it even just right now, we've got the new sky in place, but in my opinion, it doesn't seem cohesive. It seems like the sky is very artificial in this implementation. And so what we need to do is to try to, now blend it all together. And doing so is going to require us to have to isolate different parts of the image and modify them. So now before I isolate this sort of middle ground here, I do want to kind of deal with like that haloing effect. We can still see a little bit of it happening around here. So one technique we already mentioned was using the, if you're using the background eraser to isolate by reducing its sharpness. Sometimes if you're using selections, you don't really have that option. Let's see here, select the right layer. And let's change our selection mode to opacity. And with the magic wand selected, we can kind of get this region, right? The transparent region, right? And it's all, actually, just to make this better, I'm going to select contiguous so that it only gets the pixels that are all in this region. And you can see that's a pretty good selection, but what we want to do is actually isolate just this edge, this sort of region around here, because that's what we want to work on. So then what we can do is we can say selection, modify, and then come all the way down to select selection borders. And then what this dialog will do is it'll kind of give us the option to set what, how big do we want to move, top bottom from where that edge of that selection is. And this is kind of nice because it's isolating the region that we want to work with. And so 6 seems to be pretty good, but I can see, for example, it didn't quite grab this little region down here. So I can very easily just change to the freehand selection tool. And as this thing is saying here, if I hold shift and just draw, this extra region there, it now pulls it in, no problem. All right, so even though the halo has been pretty well mitigated by my background eraser, one technique that I found works pretty well to kind of chase that with, to make, get any even stray lines, out of there, is with this sort of edge selected as you see here. If we go to Effects, Edge Effects, and then Erode, what we'll see is that now takes it a step further and has even removed, the tiny white line that was haloing, these different edges. And you can do erode multiple times to, if it seems like the first pass didn't quite do it. You're going to have to experiment for sure. It'll work better in some contexts than others. I think it works really well, especially if the trees have a lot of jaggedy details. It can really get in there and remove any kind of haloing that happens there. So now that we have removed the halo, then what we want to do next is then isolate this region here. And the way I'm going to do that is by duplicating this one, and I'm actually going to call this one the middle ground. And the top one we're going to call the foreground. And the reason this is going to work out is because we're going to hide the middle ground and we're going to turn off our fake sky so that we can kind of see it again. And then I'm going to, on the foreground, return back to my background eraser and then just erase this mountainy, middle ground, if you will. And once again, it works pretty well. helps us kind of create that separation with the tree line. It's not going to be perfect, but it'll get us there. It's just enough for it to blend in with the rest of the scene. This one, as you can see, didn't quite do as well as the sky did, but it's just going to be a matter of using the regular eraser and just kind of chasing after to get some of these little strays. And it's not super important, in my opinion, in this case, to get every single little nook and cranny and dot that's kind of around there. This is just trying to clean it up just a little bit so that there's as few artifacts as possible. Since this is like a mountain terrain, even a small amount of texture, like this is really not going to be that noticeable. All right, so now we have our isolated foreground, and then what we'll see is that now if I turn the middle ground back on, essentially this area is now isolated. And then if we turn what I'll rename as sky back on, we have all three pieces isolated so that we can work on them separately to get this blend to go. So the first thing that I want to do to try to get a little bit more cohesion between these three areas is I feel like the middle ground needs to be darker. So in the interest of using layer adjustment layers, again, if we want to isolate it to a single layer, we're going to have to put it into a layer group. And then with middle ground selected, I can say, add a levels adjustment. And really all I want to do is kind of like darken it slightly. I just want to kind of like give it a little bit more definition so that it matches the level of like contrast of the sky. I feel like if it's too grayed out, then you kind of expected there to be sort of this fog or haze and that the sky would be just as washed out. But since our sky is nice and bright, we need to kind of pump the contrast of that rock region over there. And since it's an adjustment layer, we can always come back and modify. All right, next, since the sky itself is overall kind of brighter in color, I feel like the foreground needs a vibrancy boost. So once again, we can select foreground, create a new layer group, and then with the foreground layer selected, add an adjustment layer of vibrancy. And then in here, we're just really like pumping it up just a little bit, just to kind of get it to match a little bit more with the level of color that is in the sky. All right. And then now, what I'd like to do as well is kind of increase the contrast overall of all the ground elements that are not the sky. And so again, using the same concept of layer groups, if I want to isolate just the two foreground areas, I'm going to create a new layer group around those two, and then above both of them, I can bring up another levels layer adjustment. And then just darken it ever so slightly. And this is going to affect both. So I have, a way to kind of modify this middle ground, but then also I'm modifying both at the top level. So now I feel like, the contrast of the foreground, the contrast of sort of this middle ground is a little bit more balanced with the sky. And I feel like this sky color now blends in a little bit better. I do feel like the rocks in the back are a little too blue. It's almost like they blend in with the sky a little too much. So what I can do is go back to the group that has that sort of middle ground, that rocky area, and then on top of levels, I can add another adjustments and go to vibrancy. I accidentally held shift. That's why the prompt didn't come up. So then if I go to properties, then I can go and adjust that. And what I want to do is actually decrease the vibrancy of the rocks just so that it creates a little bit more visual separation without changing the luminance. So then by making it a little bit more gray now, it doesn't really blend in with the sky, and it's a much more discernible region of the image. All right, and so then now if we want to kind of get a better sense of the difference between the two, the modify that we've done and the original, we can grab everything and put it in a new layer group. And then now we can see this was the original, much less saturated, mountains much further back in the fog, if you will, as opposed to now we have this bright blue sky and the whole scene itself is kind of increased in contrast and in vibrancy, so that it at least matches. It at least matches the sky, and that you get kind of a better, cohesive sense of the way that this image comes together, and that the sky is a little bit more believable in this transition. So that's it for this one. We just covered 2 different techniques for sky replacement, focusing on some of the techniques for how to blend an image with the new sky, while touching on some techniques for mitigating the common problem of having the halo right at the edge of where the foreground meets the sky. As always, if you have any questions or would like to suggest content, feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to get updates of new videos that I post, click the subscribe button, and you can check the video description for ways to support and engage the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.